This week on A Lively Experiment, the frontrunner in next month's election for the 1st Congressional District rejects a call from his opponent for multiple debates. And Rhode Island often tries to replicate what's being done in Massachusetts. So why not tax cuts using millions from a hefty state surplus?
A Lively Experiment is generously underwritten by...
Hi, I'm John Hazenwhite Jr. For over 30 years, A Lively Experiment has provided insight and analysis of the political issues that face Rhode Islanders. I'm a proud supporter of this great program and Rhode Island PBS.
Joining us on the panel, Steve Frias, National Committeeman for the Rhode Island Republican Party, political contributor Bob Walsh, and Republican strategist Lisa Pelosi. Welcome into this week's Lively. I'm Jim Hummel. History was made again in Washington, D.C. this week. We'll have much more on now former Speaker Kevin McCarthy's ouster on Tuesday. But first, during the primary season, Gabe Amo went anywhere and everywhere trying to introduce himself to the voters of the 1st Congressional District. That included a robust debate schedule. Up until earlier this week, though, he had agreed to only one debate with his Republican challenger, Gary Leonard. Bob, let me begin with you. He has since now agreed to Channel 10, but it's far short, I think, of what some people that I talk to think he should do. Politically, probably a good move, but I don't know about the optics.
Politically, probably a good move. The optics are probably neutral. I told one of our reporter friends, Jim, that I blame the media because instead of...
Why not?
Because instead of asking the question, hey, will you commit to at least 3 debates against your opponent if you win the primary during the primary debates? And there were 12 of them or something. They asked whether they liked Mr. Lemon or Dells. So the media could have straightened this out, and I guarantee you in every future debate they will ask in the primary.
Do you think they thought that Gabe Amo was going to win the primary? I mean,
no, they should have asked all the
of them.
candidates. Ask all the candidates. Are you committed to debates? I don't think it's going to make a big difference. I guess the commitment is now to do the 2 major televised debates. I understand why in the politics of a race where your opponent is not well known at all, why would you give them free media when you're paying for media? And I think Gabe's going to run the same general election campaign he did in the primary. I call it the tortoise and the hare race. You just keep going along, you do your work, you raise your money, and you go on TV heavy at the end when people are finally paying attention and voting. It worked for him in the primary, it'll work for him in the general.
Steve?
I think it's obviously, I think I agree with Mr. Walsh in that it's probably not going to hurt him much at all. And it is a political move to basically say, hey, I'm going to win this. I have the money, I have the resources. I don't need to give the time of day to the public to have a debate on these issues. But I've always believed that people need to have a debate, public officials, when they're running for office, and it's a detriment to the public. And actually, I think it's reflective in some ways to me with Mr. Amo that he thinks he can get away with it now. What do you think he's going to get away with when he's in Washington? If you're going to ignore the public and say, I don't want to give you time for a debate, and I'm only going to do it with pulling teeth, then, this is what starts happening with politicians. They get away with it, and then it's hard to hold them accountable.
I didn't even know who he was when his name first came out. So I know him
4 or 5 months ago, yeah.
4 or 5 months ago. So I think there was a very small political circle who was aware of him. But the general public, I think we were all saying, who is this person? So he really benefited from all the public exposure that he got. And I thought it was a little off-putting for him to say, now that I won the primary, that I'm not going to do more than one debate. Well, what really concerns me is early voting starts in a couple weeks. And these 2 debates on the 2 television stations don't happen until after the early voting starts. So,
well, presumably then the people who vote early will already know who they want to choose and vote and have enough information. And those who want more information can wait and watch the debates at the end.
I know, but again, if you're trying to do the best process for the voters to see both candidates side by side, you should wait.
Well, the voters can wait to vote if they so desire, based on that theory, right? You don't have to vote early.
Well,
I know if I lived in the 1st district, I'd vote early because I would vote for Gabe.
Well, a lot of people said that with Don Carlson, wasted vote. It's buyer beware to me. Bob, the issue I have is Gabe Amo said, look, likable guy, and I agree with your analysis. The thing that I have a problem is, he says, well, people know where I stand. People don't know who you were 4 months ago. So unless you were locked in on the primary, and this whole deal, everybody knows where I am because I went out and did it. I think that's a little disingenuous.
Obviously, I love debates. If I was did a comeback and did this again 30-something years later. I debate all the time, even if my advisors told me not to. But I appreciate the advice and the strategy. And by the way, no one is working harder than Gabe Amo as a candidate. He is everywhere. I ran into someone yesterday that said they saw him 3 times in the last week doing events in their community. So he is the Energizer Bunny of candidates. So he's working hard. He's getting his message out there. He's just not choosing to use his platform to elevate an opponent who most people can't name. Who, by the way, is a nice guy, and the Republicans were lucky to recruit someone like that to run for office. But it's a foregone conclusion in this race.
I think the problem, though, is, going to a lot of events, being out there, that's one thing. But when you're in a debate, unexpected things can happen. You're being questioned. You're under the microscope. That's when people see sometimes who you are and how you handle these sorts of critical questions. And that's why debates are important. Canned statements, press releases, scripted events is not the same as a debate where you're being questioned and you're forced to address certain issues by your opponent and by the media. Simple as that.
We talk about it almost every election cycle. I wonder how much of this is driven by consultants. Because if it were me, and I don't think he has much to worry about. I mean, what's he going to worry about? A little bit of a slip. If I was the candidate, I'd tell the consultants, you know what, I appreciate your advice, but let's do 5 or 6. Let's just do it.
Right, yeah, and I think he should have done that, and I think Gary Leonard shouldn't have asked for as many as he did, to start with.
Yeah, that was
it was a high negotiating.
Yeah.
But we don't really have debates anymore. We have forums where we throw questions at all of them. I would have rather in the primary have seen real debates among 4 or 5 candidates instead of these 12 people on a stage.
Some of the bottom feeders. What does Gary Leonard have to do now, though? I mean, apart from the debates, he's got, we're a little more than a month out, a little less than a month out.
It's that boots on the ground. That's what Gabe did during the primary, that he just the knocking on doors, so he really just needs to get his, person out there, his people out there and doing it. I remember when Patrick Kennedy would run, the Republican opponent would always get about 35% anyway. So there's a built-in. Yeah. But this district is so Democrat right now, so it's a real upheld challenge for him, and maybe he should be thinking about next year. This is just Gabe in for the year until next year's election. So put down a nice framework and then run again.
And still get 35% of the vote.
Yeah, well the difference is this is a special election. So in a special election is where things can happen. That means about turnout. So what Mr. Leonard would have to do is really do an incredible job of turning out base Republican-type voters, the people who generally vote Republican. They may be about a third generally in that district, but if you have a high percentage of them come out and the Democrats take it for granted, you can score some points and maybe make it competitive. And also, you got to give people a reason not to vote for Gabe Amo. And there are reasons you can come up with, potentially. That he's basically a Washington political operative over time, went from lobbying to being in the White House, and that, in contrast, Mr. Leonard is a colonel and has served our country. So you got to come up with a reason to vote against a Democrat and then get your base out and motivated. I'm not going to say he's going to even, he'd win, but at least you could make it competitive and then build from there on the future.
I think the debate is a greater risk for Colonel Leonard than it is for Gabe Amo, in all honesty, because there's one question that will divide the Rhode Island Republican electorate right down the middle. How do you feel about Donald Trump? Trump has some hardcore supporters in the Republican Party, even in the 1st District, and I suspect that Colonel Leonard does not think very highly of Donald Trump, and he would say so because he seems like an honest, straight shooter, and he would turn off some of the normal Republican constituent. It's what I used to say to Alan Fung when he was running in the 2nd District last time. I said, Trump is your worst enemy. You're not like him.
Final thought on that?
Yeah, it's just what's the voter turnout going to be? Are they kind of weary? So how many people actually will come out for it? So we'll see.
Yeah, not nearly as many as in the Democratic primary. All right, speaking of Donald Trump, back to Washington. Now, former Speaker Kevin McCarthy was the first ever to be removed as House Speaker. There's a big vacuum in Washington now. Several names are coming forth. This is all probably going to be decided by the time we have a show next week. Steve, let me begin with you as a national committee man. We're sitting here in Rhode Island. What do you think about all this going on?
Pretty sad. And I'll start out, of course, from the Republican Party perspective, I think we looked pretty dysfunctional. I think this is not why people voted for Republicans to go to Congress, to see sort of this behavior. But I'll also say it was a sad day for America in general. And I'm not a big Kevin McCarthy fan, you know what I'm saying? But what happened here is a person worked with Democrats to keep the government open in a bipartisan way. And instead what occurred What should have happened is that the 8 or 7 Republicans who didn't like that should have been just sidelined. But instead, the Democrats with them decided to take the guy down after doing what I thought was a responsible thing, which is try to work when you're in divided government, work in a responsible manner by working with the other side to keep government open. And the Democrats saw the gain in bringing McCarthy down, but the big loser is going to be bipartisanship going forward, and the long term, the ability for this country to work together when it's divided government.
I think that's what's depressing, is that even 10 or 20 years ago, you could have people come across the aisle saying, what are we doing here? I mean, we can't have the government shut down. Now there are a couple of people who just want to seem to blow it all up, and they don't really care.
They're rebel rousers, and to do that. And to me, what is so disappointing about the Republicans, it's the short game. So the short win right now, but in the end, it looks like what will happen next year with the general election if the Democrats take over and win the House. So I don't know how many of these Republicans who were so happy that they knocked out Speaker McCarthy are looking down the road to see what is this going to, the impact on our races next year.
It's, when the other side's doing your job for you, you don't have to say much more. But Kevin McCarthy lost the speakership the day he got it by negotiating with terrorists in his own delegation.
But that's the only way he could get it.
And then maybe that's where the greater goal is to say no and keep it going at the upfront. Because when you say any one person here can make the motion, you put a time limit on yourself. And ironically, McCarthy was a deeply partisan Republican and gave the Democratic Party in the Congress a hard time, but he did see the greater wisdom of a bipartisan budget bill. So it is unfortunate that that was his undoing. But there is not, and there are so few folks who have been around long enough in Congress to remember what bipartisanship really looks like, that it's probably going to take another cycle for it to come over. And Patrick McHenry did himself no favors. The first thing he did in the job as the interim speaker was he told Nancy Pelosi, who had a little hideaway office down the hall, which is the courtesy extended to former speakers of the House, Republican or Democrat, she had one day to pack her stuff out and move it out. She wasn't there. She was in California at the funeral of her very good friend, the late Senator Dianne Feinstein.
Yeah, I don't think Nancy Pelosi was going to be moving boxes, but point taken.
I mean, about the Nancy Pelosi office space, I never care about those kinds of issues. I mean, these politicians with office space and parking lots.
Optics were horrible and cruel.
The optics is
they were cruel.
The optics was bad. Was the Democrats working with Matt Gaetz, voted with Matt Gaetz to take down a speaker who had just worked with them to keep the government open. That's the real optics that matter. Now, in regards to this, the negotiation at the beginning, look, for almost our entire history, you could have one person make a motion to vacate, okay? Except for 4 years, almost our entire history, one person can make the motion to vacate. Why that never worked before is that if you had one part of the party do that, the other party just wouldn't go along with it. They weren't into that stuff. And this time the Democrats said, let's take advantage of it and bring down McCarthy. That's why it happened.
And you know what's so short-sighted about this, too, is he's the devil we know. So Scalise and Jim Jordan are more to the right of Kevin McCarthy. So who's next coming up, there? So I don't know if the Democrats thought about, do they just want to get rid of Kevin McCarthy? But who was thinking a little long-term of who's next up in the succession plan? So who knows how the next week's going to go in the vote? And if it's not the two of them, how many weeks? So we know it took 5 days for Kevin McCarthy to become Speaker earlier in January. How long is this one going to take?
I just think, there are probably some Republicans who are like, we want to work with the Democrats, but we're worried about the backlash. And I'm sure the word came down from Hakeem Jeffries. Look, we're going to vote together. We're not going to do it. I bet there were some Democrats in the rank and file who said, let's go for McCarthy.
I think it was a robust conversation
and it's
in the
too
caucus,
bad those on either side can't come together because the leadership's telling them not to do it.
I think it's the way things are there on both sides, right? I mean, I think it's a little extreme to blame the Democrats for this outcome, but but that's where the votes went, right?
It always, when something bad happens like that, it takes two to make something bad happen. And like they have this thing called the Problem Solvers Caucus, which are moderate Democrats. They didn't solve any problems, those guys. They just created some more.
Yeah, well, I also think that McCarthy didn't do himself any favors when he tried to spin a potential government shutdown and put it on Biden. I thought that was ridiculous. And, I mean, I understand why he did it, but everybody's like, look, this is your mess. Clean it up.
I'll tell you this. Had Alan Fung been successful in his race and been down there.
He could have been the peace broker.
No. I would have been on the phone to him the next day and said, all right, now's your time to come home to the Democratic Party. Because how could you stand this nonsense, really?
Yeah, I'm not sure that would happen.
Well, sometimes it's good to
I keep
try to
trying.
still be the voice in the caucus to try to, affect change. So, you don't have to switch parties if you truly believe.
Don't
that
listen to her, Alan. Come home to the Democratic Party.
All right, there's been good budget news, actually, with all these storm clouds hanging for the out years. Rhode Island is running a larger than expected surplus, and yet still no specific tax breaks. Governor McKee talked about this a little bit on the radio this week. Massachusetts, and the reason we're talking about this is Massachusetts has been doing targeted tax breaks for seniors, disabled. They brought back some of the brought down some of the capital gains. Now, I heard the governor on the radio the other day say, look, we eliminated the car tax, we did the tangibles, but also I think people look to the north. We always try to emulate Massachusetts. Why can't we squeeze a little of that money out in a direct tax relief?
Yeah, and I think he tried to do that in his budget proposal with the sales tax. But you remember we
0.15.
Right, and when we calculate, every family would save $70,
Right.
and then it became $35 per year, to do that. So I don't, as a taxpayer, I don't want the money coming back to me in that kind of small increment. Spend the money on the problems that we have and make a bigger impact with it.
Yeah, Bob?
Well, Lisa said, spend the money on the problems that we have and make a bigger impact. You can't start talking about tax cuts when we have the homeless problem, when we have 900 kids in the state who need early intervention and are still on a waiting
But
list.
DHS is running a $16 million surplus.
That's because they
haven't
can't fill
spent.
positions. They can't fill positions. We have plenty of needs for the money. You want to compete with Massachusetts, which is a higher income tax rate at the top bracket than we do. You want to compete with Massachusetts, and you want to raise wages, make the teacher salaries competitive, make the salaries competitive for all the places we're losing people across the border to Massachusetts. When we are matching Massachusetts in educational outcomes and reducing homelessness and all the other things we compare ourselves to Massachusetts in, then go wild with tax cuts. But until then, what my Republican colleague on the panel said, spend the money and make a difference.
Yeah.
Well, I will tell you this. That's not the typical Republican message, what Lisa said. I think she knows
They're
that.
divided.
Yeah, we're divided on this one. I've always believed that I'd rather have money in my pocket and decide how I want to spend it, even if it's $1, than have somebody else do it for me. And I'll tell you this. I grew up in Massachusetts. I came here about 30 years ago, and
You were coming for 4 years and you just never
I
left,
stayed
right?
here, and I think I look at it and I say, my father and my mom they're doing better than me because of the tax situation. I mean, they're getting some of that tax relief. The death tax is also changed in Massachusetts. It's a liberal state, but they're much more competent.
Well, they have a lot more money.
Okay,
They have
and
a lot more money.
period. They're a more competent state for management, and on taxes in general, on schools, they're better. And we have to start figuring out how to get to that level, and we don't. Instead, it's like, let's go spend something here, let's go spend something there. And until our taxes are competitive with Massachusetts, we're not going to be able to compete with Massachusetts.
Okay, so when I read that the Department of Human Services didn't spend all their money, I'm rubbing my eyes because they used to be the department that overspends. That we would always
And
have
they
to
have to
come
do the
back
supplemental budget.
and to do that. So we're in a crisis in terms of employment and trying to attract people, and when we can't have the right number and qualified people at nursing homes taking care of our folks. So have that money go toward people's salaries so we can attract people and fill these jobs. That's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Lisa. I would rephrase your statement and say, until our wages are competitive with Massachusetts, we're not going to compete with Massachusetts.
The wages are not look, when it comes to business, how do you get businesses to come to a state? And partially it's either the tax climate's good or you have a great educated workforce. It's usually the combination of the two up here in the Northeast. And when our school system is mediocre to subpar and our taxes are high, it's not going to happen, and the wages are not going to come.
Our taxes all in are not actually high.
When the tax foundation puts you in the bottom 10%, bottom 10, then I think you're high.
We are high in property taxes. We
but
are
we
not
are-
high
but-
in the other
wait,
categories.
but-
Our sales tax is high but narrow. Our income tax is right in the range of states like ours. We're high compared to
States-
Alabama.
Okay, but see, states like ours, so
Yeah,
states that have
are
high
enlightened.
taxes.
No, states that are enlightened and treat workers well and want to provide services.
But the problem is that you compete in a national market. And when you're in the bottom,
we don't have businesses that
we used
want
to. Oh,
moving
here we go.
to
We don't
the northeast.
like certain businesses.
That's right. We don't like certain businesses. We don't like business.
jobs.
We don't.
I like to have
we
all
don't
sorts
like
of jobs.
bad
See,
jobs.
this is the
We
debate
don't
that we want to see between
this,
Gabe
you're right. This
Amo
is actually
Yeah, this should be the Gabe Amo, Gary Leonard debate.
Right. Well, this would be the.
Are you
Gabe.
glad that I didn't put you between these
Except
two?
for-
They
Well,
would be
I
talking
could be
right
doing this right now.
It's possible Gary agrees with me and Lisa, though. So
Well,
it'll be all
I
of
will
us.
tell
against
you,
me,
we've
but
come a
that's
long
okay.
way. When I was in high school, I went to high school in Massachusetts when it was Taxachusetts, right?
Right.
That seems like
That's
a
what
very distant memory. All right, did you want a last word on that? Last word on that?
We had a few
bring us
words.
back. We'll keep going. This is a fundamental disagreement that we have.
All right, we
Take
are
it outside.
We are take it outside the studio. We are taping on a Friday morning. On Thursday night, the Providence City Council overwhelmingly approved a proposal put forth by Mayor Smiley. He's been talking about this a long time for payment in lieu of taxes. It's the acronym is PILOT, and basically this is the 4 colleges and universities in Providence contributing millions of dollars over the next 20 years to try to offset some of the city expenses. So, Bob, let me begin with you. I know there was some protests. I always find it funny. These are the Brown University students who don't want to call it Columbus Day, and they don't realize that it was founded on slave trading. But they have a narrow. Brown University. I know you guys are both graduates there. They seem to be a little out of touch that the fact that they're giving millions and millions and millions of dollars.
I will say, since you started with that, I will say I was amused by a comment from a Brown student who says, well, it wasn't until I got to college that I was aware that colleges don't pay property tax. So I'm saying, well, Steve and I both in high school took the course on taxation policies and municipal and state government. So we knew when we got to Brown they didn't pay taxes. But that naivete aside, I think Mayor Smiley and Council President Miller did a good job by and large. I had a front row seat 20 years ago when David Cicilline was new mayor and negotiated the first one of these. I hate that we have to do it. I wish the state fully funded pilot. I think that, nonprofits are supposed to be different types of entities. I think that the problem 20 years ago is we changed the nature of relationships, so it's purely transactional now between our nonprofits and the city. That said, I think they do have an obligation. I remember the math from 20 years ago. We said, well, you're getting police and fire services. We should figure out about what that costs to service your entity, and we should find a way to assess you for it.
Is Brown picking up its own trash?
Brown picks up its own trash, and they have their own campus police that all went through the academy. Sure. So they have the gold badge thing, and even back then they adopted which the students don't like that either. But I think that a lot of credit goes to the mayor in doing this. A lot of credit goes to the council of seeing the big picture that we are legally entitled to nothing. We've got probably the best deal net in the country. I don't know if they should be going after a lifespan or not. I have to think about that. So I'm not totally on board with that part of it.
So I think I need to disclose that I'm one of the 4 schools that were in the negotiation to do that. But that said, words matter, and in this case, it's voluntary payments, and then there's the state pilot program. And what sometimes gets pushed off to the side is not only are the schools coming forward with the agreement that we've come together with millions of dollars over 20 years to be very predictable to the city of Providence, a budget coming in. The city of Providence gets money from the state of Rhode Island under the payment in lieu of taxes program. So they get the money from the universities, plus right now the pilot is funded at 27%, so they get 27% of that. So it's not a bad deal. And I do want to commend the mayor and the council president. This was a good negotiation. This was not blood on the floor and good bad will coming out of it. This was well done. And I think the council recognized that the schools stepped up. We know that this was the right thing to do. And now we can work together collaboratively on a lot of other initiatives to help the city of Providence going forward.
Brown grad, what do you think?
Look, I think it's probably the best deal Smiley could come up with right now. I have some personal kind of like critiques of it, but everyone probably would. Like first, I'm not a big fan of making long-term or 20-year agreements for these sorts of things. I'm much more into smaller time periods because you can't project what's going to happen in the future. Those payments increase at a rate of about 2.5%, 3% over 20 years. You could have high inflation. And all of a sudden,
the endowment will go up $2 billion.
Well, yeah, and the other thing too is you have to project what the city of Providence's financial problems are going to be. They're going to have some significant financial problems. Every time there's a recession, the state gets a hit, the cities and towns get a hit. So people's property taxes are going to go up by more than 2 or 3%.
You make a great point, because Cicilline's, which you were involved with, that you referenced to, sounded like a great deal at the time. By the end, it didn't look so good.
Well, again, the comparison has to always be to nothing. You got nothing. There was no legal entitlement to anything. What they should have done, what you could add to the agreement still, I think Lisa is saying, and we'll team up together to try and get an increase in the pilot percentage for all the communities.
I think it's hard for people to swallow lifespan when they see Tim Babineau, the former president, getting $3 million. They have more public relations people earning high salaries. You could eliminate half of them and give, it's just my own personal feeling.
Well, and you've got to do a different type of assessment.
I understand healthcare is in
provide
difficulty, but it's kind of the disconnect.
And I think they will. I watched the interview with the new head of Lifespan on Channel 12 last week, and I think, he's very matter of fact. Yeah, well, we just haven't had the negotiations yet, and they're doing it now.
Let's get to outrageous and/or kudos. Lisa, let's begin with you this week.
So I was watching the Patriots game last Sunday, and I was thinking, my heart sank watching it, and then to learn that the Boston Red Sox came in last, so that was my initial outrage. But I do want to take 1 minute to do a kudos to Kevin McCarthy. I was really stunned that he put his speakership on the line to save the country, that he put country before self. And he didn't seem to be the type of person to do that, because you knew once he entered Congress, all he wanted ever to do was to race to that seat of power. So he had to know in the back of his head, by doing what he did, he was going to lose his speakership.
He seemed very comfortable in that press conference afterwards, like he kind of like the burden had been lifted.
I've been there, done that. I've been speaker. I can go down in history, as being a speaker. And then he walked away.
Steve, what do you have?
Basically an outrage, but more of a sad reflection, which also deals with the whole Kevin McCarthy situation, which is, Kevin McCarthy lost his speakership this week, but really the big loser was bipartisanship. This will be, because the Democrats teamed up with Matt Gaetz on this, instead of just voting present, it will become almost impossible to do bipartisan things in Washington. It will become very difficult. And when we look back at this moment historically, this will be a milestone on the road of how our government just no longer can function.
Okay, Bob, you get the last minute.
Starts in outrage and ends with a kudo, I think. I was disappointed to see the coverage in the story about Washington Trust and the redlining, and they made no admission of guilt. I read the article closely, so I can't say they were guilty, but they did agree to a settlement. And I was surprised to see the General Treasurer, Dios, weigh in on this, and I think it ends with a kudo, because I think it worked out really well. I think they got Washington Trust to come to the table, have a real conversation. I've known Ned Handy, who runs that institution now for years, and I think they had a really thoughtful dialogue, and they came up with a thoughtful plan to use that money appropriately, to redress the problems that existed with redlining and loans. I think we're going to get some robust extra banking assets in the urban core communities, and we'll see some mortgages out there at a time when people really need them, and some extra community involvement. And they took a bad situation. They were very open about it. They could have just said, we're paying our fine and moving on. But instead, they talked about it, and they came up with a plan, and it's a really good plan. So I love to see that level of cooperation. So commendation and kudos to all involved.
Spoken from a former banker.
That's
People
right.
didn't know that Bob started his career in banking. Folks, that is all the time we have. Steve and Bob and Lisa, good to see you again. Folks, come back here next week. We will have all the latest developments and a full analysis. A lively experiment continues. Have a great week.
A Lively Experiment is generously underwritten by...
Hi, I'm John Hazen White Jr. For over 30 years, A Lively Experiment has provided insight and analysis of the political issues that face Rhode Islanders. I'm a proud supporter of this great program and Rhode Island PBS.